In this video, we're going to show you how to install a ball joint on your Ford Mustang located in the lower control arm. Now, when removing the center cap, you want to be careful not to damage the wheel face itself. There is a notch right here you can go ahead and put a pry tool into. I'm going to use a plastic trim and a small pry bar, and the purpose of this here is to protect the surface, that painted surface of the wheel. Using your 19mm socket, loosen and remove your lug nuts. With the lug nuts removed, remove the wheel and set it aside. We want to separate our tie rod end from the steering knuckle itself. We're going to start by removing the cotter pin in the top here. Using a pair of pliers, we're going to go ahead and fold out the back leg on the cotter pin here. We'll grab that head of it. Now, cotter pins are one-time use, so you're going to want to go ahead and source a replacement cotter pin. And pull that cotter pin out. Now, if yours is rusted, if it breaks off while it's in there, go ahead and use a small punch. Go ahead and punch that through that hole in the ball joint stud. Using an 18mm socket, go ahead and remove the nut. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to remove it, but we're going to install it just a few threads, probably about halfway through the nut. And that's going to serve as a capture nut when we release the tie rod end from the knuckle. Now we're going to strike the knuckle with our hammer to release the tie rod end. Install our nut back on here. With the unit spun out, we're going to access the two 15mm bolts on the back side. Now, once we have those two bolts out, we want to go ahead and remove the whole caliper and bracket. Make sure you have some sort of securing strap to hold this up and out of the way. We don't want all of this weight pulling on our flex hose here. That can and will damage that hose. You can use a small pry bar to go ahead and separate that caliper and bracket. Go ahead and grab that knuckle. Go ahead and rotate that out and remove your brake rotor. Set that aside. Remove your ABS sensor from the knuckle. It is located right here. To remove it, we're going to rotate our knuckle the opposite way, and on the back side, there's an inverted Torx bolt right here. It's an E8. We're going to use that on our ratchet here. These are E8 socket here. I'm going to use an extension to get beyond the strut. You want to try and work this sensor back through the knuckle itself. You're going to wiggle this around a little bit. Now I'm using a pair of pliers. You want to be careful when doing this here, because these can break, they can crack, and just end up damaging those there. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove the harness from this retainers here. I'm going to use a pick. Go ahead and open up this retainer here. Pop that out. Slide this up and out and set that aside. Remove the ABS wire bracket using a 15/16 socket and our ratchet. Remove that bracket, set it aside. Next thing we want to do is go ahead and loosen the nuts here on our shock or strut unit itself. We're going to use a 15/16 socket here and a 21mm on the bolt head side. And we're not going to remove these bolts, just loosen these. Now at this point here, before we remove these two bolts here out of our shock unit, we want to go ahead and put your jack underneath the lower control arm here. Now what we want to do, the purpose here, is we want to hold pressure on the coil spring when we undo this, because if we undo this here, this can separate and we can have this spring discharge or cause an issue. So put the jack underneath the lower control arm, jack it up to hold some pressure on it. Once we do that, we can now go ahead, loosen the nuts off of our bolts here. Remove those nuts completely. Now by controlling the level of the jack, you can go ahead and compress this up a little bit to the point where you can actually spin these bolts out freely. Use our 15/16 socket on the ball joint nut. Let's remove that nut. You're gonna take that nut, set it aside. Now I'm gonna put a pry bar between the knuckle and the lower control arm. Just pry on that a little bit. Now I wanna hit the knuckle, and what I wanna do is go ahead and separate the knuckle from the lower ball joint. Now normally the hammer will normally work by hitting here and shocking that up. Using that pry bar will cause that knuckle to pop up, but ours is stuck. So I'm going to use an air hammer with a flat head on it. Just get up underneath the edge right here. And that worked that right off. Go ahead and set the knuckle on the hub on the bench. Now our ball joint here presses down through the bottom, and we're going to have to press up the new one up and into the control arm. There's a couple different ways you could get the ball joint out. You could use a ball joint press. You can use a hammer and just pound that out. You could use an air hammer to go ahead and work this out as well. Whatever tool you have that'll work, go ahead and do so. You just want to be careful not to damage the inside portion of the control arm, so we can go ahead and press this back up so the splines bite back into it to lock it into place. Now that we have our ball joint out, we're gonna go ahead and clean up this here. Now we're gonna use a little cleaning disc here, but we don't wanna take any metal away from the inside. We wanna make sure that that is still the same, and they're just gonna clean out any burrs of steel in there. So just a quick little cleaning. Chase it around the outside on the top. And a little bit on the bottom. Just want to make sure that our ball joint has a clean, flat surface on the bottom to mate to. I want to go ahead and press our ball joint up from the bottom. Now we're going to take our ball joint cap here. I'm going to put that on the perimeter. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap this a few times to get this ball joint to stay seated. In some cases, you can go ahead and just tap that up and in. You can use your ball joint press to also press that up into place. Now we have our ball joint press in place. This is hollow inside so that the ball joint studs can come up through the top center, and we're going to press this up through the bottom. Now you want to make sure that this ball joint is pressed in evenly and not crooked. So go ahead and do a little at a time. Periodically stop, take a look, make sure everything is working perfectly, and then continue until that ball joint is fully seated. Now when installing your lower ball joint, you want to make sure that the surface or the lip is completely flush up against the bottom of our control arm, and ours is. So at this point here, I'm going to go ahead and take your rubber cap here and pop this on. If you want to, you can pack some more grease inside the ball joint unit. Press it down and get that seated. Go ahead and line up your knuckle with that ball joint. Slide that down into place. And once that's on there, let's go ahead and put our nut on. As we tighten this down, it'll pull that knuckle down onto the ball joint shank there. Now, when we go to tighten this down and torque it, you want to pay attention to the notch in the castle nut. When we torque it down, we want to make sure that the hole in the ball joint stud lines up with the notch on the castle nut. Now, if you torque this and you come to your torque specification and the hole is not showing, go ahead and tighten this nut to the next notch that lines up with that cotter pin hole. Ours is right here. Before we torque down this nut here, let's go ahead and get our shock lined up here. We're just going to get our bolts pushed in. And we're going to get the nuts installed on the back side. Now when installing the nuts here, you want to pay attention before you tighten these down. One of these nuts has a flat surface on it. That is because our ABS bracket is going to tighten down up against that, so you want that on the top. The other nut has a little bit of a crown on it. That is going to go on the bottom. Before we torque our bolts here, we're going to go ahead and lower our jack off of the lower control arm. Go ahead and tighten these down. We can use our 15/16 wrench, tighten down our nut. Now you want to go ahead and torque the lower ball joint nut to 129 foot-pounds. Let's torque down our shock nuts to the knuckle to 148 foot-pounds. I'm going to install our ABS sensor here. I'm just going to use my pliers here and gently wiggle that as we push that into position. And go ahead and get your bolt started. You might just have to wiggle this a little bit to get that lined up. Once you have that started, I'm going to go ahead and snug it down. And once that bolt bottoms out, just give it a little bit more. You just want to make sure that that's good and snug. Take your ABS bracket. We're going to install the harness here. Install your ABS bracket. Make sure that they fit over both studs here. And then put on the nut for the upper one. And torque this nut to 21 foot-pounds. Gonna remove our tie rod and nut. I'm going to tighten this down first. Now I want to go ahead and torque this down to 41 foot-pounds. Now at this point, we want to watch and see if the notch in our cowsel nut lines up with the hole in our ball joint stud. If it does, go ahead and install your cotter pin. If the hole does not line up, continue to tighten the upper nut until the next slot lines up with the cotter pin hole. Never loosen that to get that cotter pin to fit. Put that cotter pin in. I'm going to bend over the upper portion here. Use your snippers to cut off the excess. Our next step is to install our brake rotor. Now we did manipulate our backing plate a little bit during assembly, so you do want to go ahead and make sure that the backing plate is straight as possible, and go ahead and modify or tweak things back to the way they were originally. Could be just something as minor as this little drip edge here. Next thing we're going to do is apply some anti-seize compound to the face of the wheel hub. We can go ahead and grab our brake rotor and we're going to slide that into place. I'm going to install one lug nut at the bottom here. And what this is going to do is help us hold our brake rotor flat to the hub face. Now at this point, go ahead and grab your caliper. Slide that down over the rotor. Now once you get this lined up here, go ahead and start to install the bolts on the back side. I'm just going to work that caliper and bracket back and forth a little bit so you can get that upper bolt lined up. Go ahead and get that upper bolt threaded in a couple threads. Then go ahead and tap that lower portion down. Get that lower bolt lined up. And once you have the upper one in, all you have to do is work this caliper in or out and go ahead and get that lower bolt started. Now we can go ahead and snug down these bolts here. We're going to torque them to 85 foot-pounds. And go ahead and do the same for the upper. Go ahead and remove that lug nut. Now you want to hop into the vehicle. Pump up the brakes, make sure that this caliper is expanded out and your brake pedal feels good. After you install the wheel, bring the vehicle down and get the alignment professionally performed. Install your wheel. Go ahead and get your lug nut started. And once we have those started, we can go ahead and snug those down. Once you have these snug, go ahead and lower the vehicle down and let's torque those into position. Let's go ahead and torque our lug nuts to 95 foot-pounds. Go ahead and install your center cap.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.